An explosion of anger across America as the police killing of George Floyd reignites calls for justice.
I am your president of law and order.
As the president threatens to deploy the military, will the nation be pushed to the brink? Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. The United States is bracing to see how the president, law enforcement agencies and the military will respond to growing protests over the killing of George Floyd, an unarmed black man, at the hands of white police officers. Despite the president's threats to unleash the military, thousands of people continue to take to the streets to express their anger over what they see as a culture of racism within police departments throughout the country. While protests remain largely peaceful, there has been looting and rioting and sporadic acts of violence. Security forces have used tear gas and rubber bullets on protesters. On Monday, President Trump, calling the unrest, quote, domestic terror, demanded that state officials dominate the streets.
Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
It is a divisive, painful moment in the United States, but will the protesters' call for accountability be heard? Could this moment be a catalyst for systemic change? And can we trust that this will end peacefully? To bring this in focus, I'm now joined by Marc Morial. He is president of the Urban League and former mayor of New Orleans. Mr. Morial, President Trump now threatening mayors and governors with deploying the federal troops across major American cities. In fact, he's threatening to invoke for the very first time, against the will of governors, the 1807 Insurrection Act. Is the United States today in uncharted waters?
The United States is in a unique position. We're in a great two twin pandemics, the pandemic of COVID and really the pandemic of racism, which has manifested itself in the death of Mr. Floyd, the death of Ahmaud Arbery, and the death of Breonna Taylor. I think threatening military action could be an empty, hollow threat. I think it could be a real threat. But it would only escalate matters. It would only send the worst message to the economic players in this country, and it would send the worst message to people on an international level. Let's keep in mind, those who are acting with violence are not the real protesters. The real protesters, the true protesters, those who've been deeply, deeply affected by the pandemic of racism and the death of Mr. Floyd and the witness the death of Mr. Floyd on videotape, they are the true champions of justice. And I hope that people who are watching this won't confuse those who are working and marching and protesting for the right thing with those who are out there to take advantage of matters and take advantage of the situation.
That's obviously not the way the administration is looking at the situation. In fact, this is what the Attorney General, William Barr, said.
Groups of outside radicals and agitators are exploiting the situation to pursue their own separate and violent agenda. In many places, it appears the violence is planned, organized, and driven by anarchic and left extremist groups, far left extremist groups, using Antifa-like tactics, many of whom travel from outside the state to promote the violence. We must have law and order on our streets and in our communities.
Is this a red herring to sow division, to divert from the real issues at hand?
The information I have, some of it from Minneapolis, is that the violent protesters are also linked to white nationalists and white supremacist groups. not simply to groups like the anarchists. And the anarchists are well known. They've involved themselves and intervened in marches in the United States before. They're not an unknown quantity. Their tactics are not an unknown quantity. But to say that they're the only ones, it looks like in Minneapolis and in the Minnesota situation, there are also groups tied to right-wing extremist groups, right-wing supremacist groups. We simply do not know what the story is.
Has Trump and his Attorney General been successful in shifting the narrative away from this important issue? What has sparked the outrage on the streets and onto the rioters and the looters?
I think that his desire and his desire to shift things away from real issues is well known to the American people. So he's got those that'll follow him, those that'll follow his voice. But I think the vast majority of the American people understand what this moment is about. They understand it is about the injustice that they witnessed against Mr. Floyd. And I don't think that the president and his attorney general can succeed in distracting people from the obvious. Here's what the attorney general should do. Here's what an attorney general who would follow his sworn oath would do. That attorney general would involve himself more deeply in the effort to bring about justice for Mr. Floyd, justice for Ahmaud Arbery, justice for Breonna Taylor. He would order and oversee an aggressive investigation into those incidents. He would order his Justice Department Civil Rights Division to open a pattern and practice investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department. He would reverse his position, his opposition to consent decrees and his opposition to the utilization of his power to do what the law says he should do, which is to investigate complaints of police brutality and pattern and practice discrimination.
But do you expect that to happen, though? Despite the increasing documentary evidence in some of these cases, not just the outrage that the brutal killing of George Floyd has sparked, despite all of this, the video, the 9-minute video, far too often you've got Mr. Morial, you've got far too few white police officers who actually face the law, who get prosecuted, let alone convicted. And too often, once the dust settles, they in fact very quietly get reinstated into some of these police departments, don't they?
And that's why we are so, if you will, angered by this moment, because what we see, it has been a pattern. And that's why the eyes of the world are on how this case in Minnesota is going to be handled, how the case in Louisville will be handled, how the case in South Georgia that doesn't involve police, but involves two vigilantes pretending to be police is handled. So we are going to continue to call on the Justice Department, and the people will have an opportunity to send a message in the fall as to whether they want a different type of Justice Department and a different type of Attorney General.
But do you expect the system to reform itself, though? Can change
really
come through within the criminal justice system?
We can reform the criminal justice system. We can change the laws. We can overhaul bail. We can overhaul sentencing. We can fix the way in which the public defender system works. We can
But will that really happen? Because you've heard politicians, you've heard the National Security Advisor just recently say there is no systemic racism within law enforcement. He said it was just a case of a few bad apples. But is there a culture at play here that needs to be changed?
You're talking about the National Security Advisor. I doubt if the National Security Advisor has really educated himself, but it's his opinion. His opinion is not shared by many of us, and we're going to continue to fight and work. And that's what we're saying. This is a wake-up call to this nation that now we must do police justice reform. And I don't think that the passion and the anger is going to just dissipate somehow automatically. The eyes of the nation, the eyes of the world If you look at the
But
broad-based
what will it
nature,
take, though? What will it take for this to move beyond the outrage that we see on the
it's
streets?
going to take.
What will
It's
it
going to
take for the
take.
police officers to get convicted? Do you see
It's
that
going to
happening?
take a successful. Let me say this: with Keith Ellison, the Attorney General of Minnesota, for whom I have great confidence in his ability and his commitment, I think there's going to be an aggressive prosecution. I think there's going to be a prosecution which leads to justice, and I think a conviction is very, very likely in that case. But we've got to keep our eyes on it. There's got to be continued transparency. We can't just go sit in the proverbial grandstands and watch. We've got to be active and continuing to push for it. Secondly, yesterday, I don't know if you noted the press event that we held, but we're also calling on the Congress of the United States to pass a package of police reform laws. And we're going to call on it. We're going to call on this Congress to do it. And people understand that if this Congress won't do it, then people have the power in the next session, in the elections in the fall, to bring about changes.
We talk about the black and white communities as if they were two distinct entities, but across all of the major cities in the United States, we saw how many white protesters were there, shoulder to shoulder with black protesters.
I do think you've made a really important point. And that point is, when you look at the crowds that are participating in the protests, they're black, they're white, they're Latinx, they're Asian, they're people from Native American communities, they're men, they're women. It's broad-based, and perhaps what it is the beginning of a new movement in this country, a new civil rights movement against hate, against police brutality. Maybe it's the beginning of something very different.
What does it do, though, to these protest movements when the President of the United States not just threatens to use force against the protesters, but also uses a certain language that is racially loaded historically, when he quotes from a white sheriff in the civil rights era in a southern state within the United States and says, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." How important, how consequential is this sort of language?
When he does that, he encourages the protests. When he does that, he helps remind people what they're protesting. What they're protesting is the types of policies that his administration and the lack of aggressiveness by his Justice Department enforcing civil rights. The effect of that language is to create a more determined, if you will, protester. That the protesters are not going to be deterred, they're not going to be intimidated, and they're not going to be dissuaded by that kind of bellicose language.
All right, Marc Morial, President of the Urban League and former Mayor of New Orleans, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Now, amid the tension and divisiveness, President Trump gave his first remarks since the protests began on Monday and declared himself a law and order president. Before making his statement, he took to Twitter calling the protesters thugs and suggested the looters could be shot. He threatened to equip the Secret Service with the most vicious dogs and most ominous weapons to protect the White House. Police used tear gas and rubber bullets to clear the area so President Trump could walk from the White House to a historic nearby church, displaying to the media a Bible. Will the president's words and actions appease or incite the protesters? I'm now joined by Anthony Scaramucci, who briefly served as White House Communications Director under President Trump in July 2017. The president waited a full week before he made a statement following the unrest that has been happening in the United States across major cities for a whole week. He is clearly trying to shift the message, trying to shift the narrative away from the issues at play to a show of force. He also had a Bible in his hand while he walked across from the White House to a church. Is he trying to appeal to his base more than anything else?
Well, remember, he also tear gassed his fellow citizens that were primarily peacefully protesting in Lafayette Park. So, of course, he's trying to appeal to his base. I think he's looking at the political map. A statesman would do something totally differently. They would speak to the country in a healing and unifying way. But he's looking at the political map, and he's looking at his odds of winning re-election. And his play is really just to push very hard to get as many of his base to turn out at the next election in those certain states. And so that's the play, and it's a callous play, and it's disappointing.
But when the White House labels this moment where he was standing with that Bible, making that statement of threatening to deploy federal troops against the will of governors, and when they call it an iconic moment, does that play out well with his base, or do they see through it?
No, I think it's eroding his base. Actually, I think that they do see through it, and I think it is not working, which is why he's becoming more unstable and he's becoming more irrational. If you look at the polling numbers in those states, he's getting destroyed. If you look at older women, remember he won 52% of the white women's vote in 2016. He's at 36% now. The gender gap is outstanding. The women over the age of 50 have almost completely abandoned him. And so if you go through those states, it's 6, 7, 8, 12 points. So, and I know this guy well, President Trump. Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden, is in his basement and he's whooping him, which is a great American expression for giving him a good beating.
Keep in mind that he also made that unforced error, describing the African American community or taking them for granted and taking their votes for granted when he said that those who would consider voting for Trump ain't black. I mean, can he make up that lost ground actually and channel the anger on the streets?
Well, I think,
today?
listen, I think he's already made up that lost ground. I think that in this age of constant outrage about everything that's going on, that's already yesterday's news. Just imagine where we are right now in the United States. I thought things were very bad 4 weeks ago when we were seeing rising unemployment numbers and we're in a global pandemic and we've shut down 2/3 of the U.S. economy. And now we have 40 million of our fellow citizens out of work. You want to layer on top of that a full-blown racial discord and riots and looting, and a president that's literally irresponsive to it. If anything, what he's hoping for more disarray, because he's making the bet with more disarray, he can appear stronger than somebody like Joe Biden and therefore win re-election. He thinks he's Richard Nixon in 1968 after the Democratic National Convention and those riots, but he may be closer to George Wallace in 1963 in terms of this despicable racism and this despicable behavior that will be his longstanding legacy.
But this divisive strategy of his is nothing new. The fact that he's now railing against the far left, against Antifa, we often hear him say, and against the mainstream media, which he so skillfully used to his advantage during last election, now taking on as well, going on the offensive with Twitter and social media, trying to make it seem like it's a culture war between conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans. Could that also, in the end, play into his hands?
Yeah, listen, he's a tribal leader. He's figured out that he wants to rename the United States the disunited states, and he wants to go after a certain sleeve of the American population. And so he's a very crafty human being. He has a very good insight into the impulses and the psyche of a lot of different people inside the country, and he's preying on them. And that's ultimately what demagogues do. If you study history, when a country has some distress or there is a big gap in income or there's an income inequality or unemployment, you can get the rise of leaders like President Trump. And so it's unfortunate because we all thought we were working for him in 2016 and in the early part of the administration that he was going to be somebody that could bring those people together. We thought he would be a transformative candidate and a post-partisan politician.
What would you advise him if you were in charge of his communications strategy?
Well, I would advise him to resign. He's got to resign. He's done such a terrible job, and he's been so disunifying for the country, and he has been somebody who is making the situation worse. And so if you are a citizen of the country and you're a patriot first, you should be a partisan last, and you should look at this guy and say, you got to go. And so there's only one standing elected Republican official, that's Governor Mitt Romney, that at least is speaking the truth about the situation. But no, if I was advising him, I'd say you're terrible. You've done a horrific job. People have figured out what you've known for your whole life, that you're basically a fraud. So you should leave. You should resign and see if we can repair this situation after you're gone. That would be my best advice.
You know him well enough to know that he won't resign, but do you think he's lost enough of his support among his base and independents to lose the election?
Resign.
You think he could resign?
Enough to know that he could resign. Yeah, because
what would drive him to resign?
He's looking at the math, and he's cornering himself into an almost unwinnable situation, because when you're gassing your own individual private citizens to hold up a Bible that you've never read and don't know one verse inside the Bible, when you're doing that, okay, it is proliferating through the society. Moreover, in 2020, the demographics of the country have once again changed, and that aging, older demographic has lost a lot of trust in him. Okay, he basically told them that the pandemic was just the flu. If you go through the voting numbers in Florida or some of the senior citizen states, he's getting annihilated. And so, knowing his personality, he's not going to want to get roundly humiliated in November. So yes, there is a very good chance that he could do what Lyndon Johnson did, which is say, I made America great, and drop off the stage before the election. It's not impossible.
But he's still a fighter, and he is on the offensive right now, taking on all sorts of forces, including social media. Could he be setting the stage for the day after his elections in case he is defeated?
Well, a lot of people feel that that's a risk. I didn't feel that that was a risk 5 or 6 months ago. I would have to say, okay, that I can see that risk. I don't think the American military and the people inside the government would allow that to happen. But listen, you're a student of history. I'm a student of history. Very strange things happen when you have people like this that have been placed in power.
Strange things happen. You say the mayor of Atlanta said that the United States today is a tinderbox and that President Trump's tongue is a match. Do you agree with her concern? Are you as alarmed as she is about what might happen, that the situation could get out of hand and explode?
Well, you have to be. Just look at the math. You have 40 million people that are out of work. So on a Monday night or a Tuesday night, they can roam the streets and break into storefronts and pull things out of stores. And you don't have enough, same way you didn't have enough hospital beds in the United States to handle the pandemic, you don't have enough personnel in the police forces. Moreover, you have tension in the United States for the last 150 years related to the police enforcing the law aggressively or overly aggressively in the minority areas. So you have a situation where somebody could be de-escalating it, somebody could be providing words of wisdom and unity, but you've got somebody out there with a kerosene keg pouring kerosene all over the place and striking matches. So, yeah, it's a problem. Now, the good news about the United States is that most people love the country and most people love living here. And so what will end up happening is the protesting will tire out. We'll figure out a way to get through the pandemic, and then he'll get voted out of office. And then we have to begin the process of healing the country. And we have to also figure out how to become less partisan with each other so that we can get some policies done to help these people, because you're not going to get it through monetary policy. You're not going to get it through tax cuts. You need jobs training. You need infrastructure. You need a reformatting of the public K through 12 education system in the United States. And so it is a very complicated thing. But the good news about this, I predict he will be defeated because of the antics that he's portraying right now. He is weakening every single day in the polls.
All right. Anthony Scaramucci, former White House Communications Director. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, America's history of racial brutality is a long one, 400 years. A corner was turned with President Kennedy's Civil Rights Act, but it did not stop racial discrimination. The extrajudicial killing of George Floyd is yet another case in a long list of police brutality against African Americans. It sparked outrage throughout the United States, probably the widest civil rights protests since the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. over half a century ago. Today, the US is facing multiple crises, a pandemic, an economic crisis, both affecting disproportionately African Americans, and now an upsurge in outrage in the face of racially tainted police crimes. It is wrong, though, to label what we see in major American cities as racial tensions between blacks and whites. It is not. Demonstrators are all mixed, marching to protest against injustice. But in short, what makes this moment dangerous is the direction the president may be taking, berating governors, calling them jerks, and threatening them with the deployment of US armed forces against their will. This rhetoric, whether bluster or serious, is fanning the flames of discord, and if Trump makes good on his threat, America will be in uncharted waters 5 months before presidential elections. Can he go as far as declaring martial law? The idea must have crossed his mind. Let us know what you think. Send us your thoughts on Twitter @_InsideAmerica. From me and the team here in Washington, thanks for watching.